The Jews murmured about Jesus. The Jews murmured about Jesus because what he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. The Jews murmured because what Jesus seemed to be telling them did not make sense. He told them that he came down from heaven. The Jews scratched their head and said, I thought you were the father of Joseph. How can you come down from heaven? Jesus says that he's the bread of life. How can you be bread? Bread is made of wheat or some other grain that is made into flour. And you are made of human flesh. You are not a grain. We hear Jesus tell us today that he is the bread of life. And in faith, we believe this. This is what draws us to Mass here today. We long to receive the bread of life into our hearts and into our lives. Some may say they come here today out of obligation. And others may give other reasons of why they're here today. But ultimately, let's face it, we come here for one reason. Because we long to receive. We long to be nourished by the bread of life once again. Because we know that when we receive the bread of life into our lives, into our hearts, that we get spiritually fed. Our lives get changed. Our lives get nurtured. Our lives are sustained. The bread of life heals and strengthens us and does much, much more for us. In our faith, we believe this. We know and we have experienced this. A person outside our faith, and sometimes even ourselves from time to time, we may question, how can the bread of life have such an impact on us? How can something so small, so simple, make a great impact? How does the bread of life sustain you? How does it sustain me? Sometimes the outsider doesn't understand. And sometimes we as the insider don't always completely understand either. The understanding keeps being revealed to us. In the way that we don't understand. In some ways also we may not understand how the food of choice of people who live in poverty, how that food sustains and nurtures them. Or I think of the food of choice that people ate during the Great Depression. If you grew up during this time period of the Great Depression, you may recall some of the foods you may have ate and how you ate them, and they sustained you and they nurtured you, and you might even have a craving for some of those same foods once again. For us who did not grow up in that time frame, We might read details on the kind of dishes that were prepared and ate. Or we might recall family members talking about the different kind of foods they ate during this time period of the Depression. My grandparents grew up in this time of the Great Depression, and my grandfather would talk about different foods and that he'd eat growing up during the time of the Depression. And one food that stands out to me that they ate was lard breads. And what I understand what a lard bread was, it was similar to butter breads, like when you eat soup. Instead of putting butter in between two pieces of bread, lard was used. And you know, this idea of a lard bread, in some ways it fascinates me, intrigues me in some ways. Half of me would like to try a lard bread someday. But the other half of me says the idea of lard bread is kind of disgusting, gross, and kind of unhealthy. They might call it a heart attack in between two pieces of bread. I've been told that the way that lard was prepared, it was different, in that back in the time of Depression, lard had some chunks of meat that would float in with the lard there. So I guess there might be some nutritional value. But what I do can understand is there may have been some nutritional value. But the main thing is this is the food that was available at the time to my grandfather and their family, and it sustained them. Jesus Christ, the bread of life, is something that is simple. That sometimes it can be hard to totally wrap around our minds of understanding. But we know the bread of life sustains us for life. Our faith, we know it. In our lives, we've experienced. And if God had something else available to sustain us, I think our God would make it available to us. In our scriptures today, we hear of an angel of God providing a hearth cake and a jug of water for Elijah that was enough for him to walk for 40 days and 40 nights. How does the bread of life sustain you? Jesus Christ is the bread of life. Not only does it sustain life, but Jesus Christ, the bread of life, becomes us by a receiving of this gift. And influences us on how we live our lives. Health experts will often tell us that we are what we eat. They often try to tell us that to get us to eat healthily. They tell us if we eat less healthier food, it has negative impact on our lives physically. And healthier food has a positive effect. When I think of physical food, we often think of the physical effects that it has on our bodies. But the bread of life, yes, it influences us physically. But the bread of life also influences all aspects of our lives, not just physically. But the bread of life impacts our emotionally, mentally, morally, and many other aspects of our lives. The bread of life impacts how we live our lives day in and day out. And it's in the effect that we have from the gift of the bread of life, we give witness to Christ. How, in sharing Christ, the bread of life, do you give witness to Christ in the world? How, with Jesus Christ, the bread of life, do you reflect Christ in our world?